Hi everyone, we are back and we're going to be speaking about the power of the Queen Mothers. This is another piece of our Ottoman history world, and in fact, if you remember, one of the claims of dissenting or frustrated statesmen when they said that the Ottoman Empire was in decline or changing was that women and eunuchs had too much power. But why is that? Why did the Queen Mothers have a moment of power in the 1600s? And we are going to look at that in this period. I'm not going to get through all of this timeline, but I do want to point out a few different things here. Is that during this period in the 1600s, there's actually a few different, again, depositions and executions of different sultans. But these depositions are not made to overthrow the entire family of the Ottoman Empire, the dynasty, or the change the system. Instead, it's about changing one candidate for a more pliable, interesting person. And we're going to look at that kind of over this period, and it continued basically into the 1730s, but there was a lot of them until especially 1703. So it starts, the first sultan to be deposed was this figure, Osman II, Genç Osman, or young Osman, and he was really the first sultan to be overthrown and to be killed. So you can imagine actually the Janissaries marching into the palace, coming into his room, which would have all been, again, completely in silence because no one was allowed to speak or make loud noises there. And then basically finding the Sultan and a person they probably had never seen or encountered ever, and executing him, strangling him with a piece of wire. At that point, he would have been only 18 years old, and he came to power after his uncle, Mustafa I, was declared mad and removed him from power, and they basically didn't have anyone else from the dynasty who was up to the task or viable as a possible sultan, and therefore he was given the sultanate. Now we'll get into why that is, why he ended up being the only male heir that could come to power at that time. But I do want to point out that there is a significance to Osman II's execution. One, I think it's a vision in which the Sultan is no longer supreme leader, right? By this point, power had been distributed amongst different people in Ottoman society, both in the court, right? So we have more courtiers, women, bureaucrats, eunuchs, etc., all and janissaries, all being part of this world, fighting in different factions, trying to get their candidate for sultan to be the one to be put into power. And when eventually that coalition falls, the sultan would fall with them, and therefore a new sultan would come to power. Often that is why there's so many depositions at that time. And in many ways, this is also what some might call the end of a patrimonial state, a state centered around this kind of central leading figure. Of course, the Sultan continued to be a person of great importance, but it was no longer, essentially, power was distributed in many different ways, and the Sultan really was almost a figurehead through which all sorts of different parties of Ottoman society fought and did politics with each other to decide about their future. So in some ways, it was a sort of indirect democracy. It wasn't through popular representation, but it was a way in which multiple groups could express their vision of the future. So what that means is that when we have these images of the Ottoman dynasty like these ones that are produced, in which again they're very proud of the fact that they go from male heir to male heir to male heir, uninterrupted, without switching over to any other family member, and they go from the very earliest to the very latest. But what was really behind the politics of the empire? What was going on? And as we already pointed out, there's some larger transformations occurring here. One of them is that freeborn Muslims are forcing their way into the government. They're often called ejnabis or foreigners, and that's because the devshirme at this moment ends. There's too much pressure for a new group, and basically freeborn Muslims and new blood to enter into the state. They can no longer have an elite raised entirely through slavery. So the devshirme has ended, but does this mark the end of slavery? And as we'll see, no, because elite women continued to be, who were involved in politics, continued to be involved and recruited through slavery. And of course, there was also just normal slaves that people would buy and have in general. So of the different centers of power that were emerging in the 17th and 18th centuries, you have these different groups, which is kind of the Queen Mother, as we'll be talking about today, but you also have the Grand Vizier, the Sheikh al-Islam, the chief jurist, preachers, including some very popular, powerful street preachers, janissaries, eunuchs, scribes, and bureaucrats, and the people themselves, the urban crowd. And I think this mix of people and politics at that time is what makes the 17th century probably the most interesting part of Ottoman history, a period when you really get a lot of new perspectives, new ideas emerging, and a lot of fighting and attacking. But let's move on to the discussion at the moment, which is how did the harem become a center of power at that time? Now, if you imagine what a harem might look like, you're probably influenced by images created through early 19th century Orientalist paintings depicting the harem as a space of sensuality, of wild sex, or of despotism, etc. Though we have to really put that away, even though it still very much continues today, even if evoking the term harem, and think about something as basically a private space for the female members of a dynasty or household. Every house, if a house had more than one woman, basically had women in it, it would have a sort of harem, what was called the haremlik, the kind of private area of the family. Now, not every man, of course, would have a concubine, but the women folk and children were kind of kept in the private area, and then there was a public area called the salamlik that would is where people would meet. And the palace was, in a sense, also organized in that way. By the way, on the left here is a picture of a harem taken by the women of the harem themselves, in this case, the Iranian Qajar palace women. Now, this is a model of the Topkapi Palace. Remember, there's 3 courtyards, each one signaling further and further power. And so the actual part with the harem, the part where the sultan ended up staying most of the time, is this part here. This is where the divan would be. And this cluster of buildings is where basically the sultan, his many concubines, their children, and many servants, or all slaves, were basically living very closely to each other. And it's in this area that you really ends up being the center of power, and one, because the sultan ends up retreating into that area. So who held power in the harem? How do we actually understand what was going on there? So there's 2 major players here. The Valide Sultan, who was the queen mother of the standing sultan. Okay, so there might be multiple concubines. Again, the moment that they have a male son, they stop having sex with the sultan, and then they focus all their energies on ensuring that their son becomes the sultan. And then once if he becomes the sultan, they spend all their energies ensuring his position and his success. The other major figure is the Haseki, the chief consort, the chief concubine, basically the sultan's favorite, sometimes is translated, but she would be the person in charge. This could be a shifting position, but she would be another major figure. Now, those are the 2 major women who are in charge of a large group of other women in there, including other slaves who are there to serve the women. But there's also the eunuchs, in particular the chief black eunuch, what's called the Kislar Asir, the lord of the girls or women, is the one who is actually controlling access to the harem, and also is an incredibly powerful figure. Okay, so just like the administrators the administrators and soldiers of the janissaries, that is, of the Ottoman dynasty during the 15th and 16th century were all slaves. Also, everyone in the harem was basically a slave. They were all recruited through slavery, and they functioned as slaves. Now, what's interesting is that while in the 17th century, basically the devshirme and penjik stopped being used as a tool of recruitment for male people in the dynasty, male bureaucrats and servitors of the dynasty. That's not true for women. In fact, all the harem continued to be and eunuchs recruited through slavery all the way into the 19th and 20th century. The other important part to notice here is that the reason why these people became powerful is because the sultan increasingly became inaccessible. So just like celebrities today, the idea is that access takes away your kind of ideal of exclusivity and specialness. And so therefore the ideal was that the sultan would rarely be seen except in extremely uncommon ceremonial occasions, and then from a distance, if anything. He would not be someone that you would engage with on an everyday matter. And that's why people, many of the statements complained that the sultan wasn't directly accessible or involved in day-to-day governance, or he wasn't on the campaign trail, etc. Instead, he was supposed to be seen as a sort of detached figure who ensured justice in the world, but it wasn't actually present at all moments. And instead, he spent most of his time actually in the harem, and therefore the people who had access to him, the Validu Sultan, the Hasaki, and the chief black eunuch, were the ones that had the most power, because he still kind of, his will still allowed the continuation of government. Now, to understand why this system worked and why these women ended up in power, we kind of have to figure out basically the nature of the dynasty and the succession. The whole purpose of the harem is not to make sultans sexually happy. The purpose of the harem is to ensure the procreation of the dynasty. It's to ensure that there's another heir, that there's always future candidates out there that can be picked and trained and developed. Now, what that means is that they always have to have enough young princes and will, let's say, ready to take up the thing. But the problem is that the succession policies of the Ottomans from the beginning were kind of inimical to these ideas. So let's go back like 1300 beginning. They had a sort of survival of the fittest between brothers. So they don't have primogeniture, right? They don't pick the firstborn. They pick instead, they allow the brothers to fight each other and then kill each other. And that one is the one who ends up taking the entire realm. On the same hand, they also don't do what other Turkic dynasties do, which is split the whole realm or polity amongst all male heirs. They allow only one heir to inherit it. And so what happens, the princes were sent out to the provinces and then to practice being rulers. Then the moment the father died, they would run back to the capital and then kind of try to get as many different factions on their side until it was clear that there was one clear winner, and he would basically eliminate his brothers. Now, while they were in the provinces, of course, they had their harems, they were making children, etc. So even if one of the other brothers died, there was always sons that by this point were probably teenagers who could then fill in for the father. So that's what happened with Suleiman, right? His father died after 8 years in power. He quickly came to power, but when he died, he actually switched it to a system of semi-primogeniture. So basically, again, only one, there was a designated heir, but on top of that, he actually killed his half-brothers upon the coronation. So the moment, there was always this kind of dread, because the moment they knew that a sultan would be crowned or put upon the throne, basically a line of coffins would be carried out of the harem, of the palace. And in fact, if you go today to the graves of Sultan Selim II or other people, you would actually see buried alongside him, the tombs are these little tombs, which are the tombs of his children, which have been killed in these succession processes. Now, this wasn't very popular, and it set up a system in which these new sultans basically had no heirs for the first few years, and they had to wait until the heirs grew up, because while they were waiting, they weren't often set out. They increasingly were kept in the palace, and this was sort of instituted ultimately in 1617. What they did is that instead of killing all of the male members, they just kept everyone in the palace. They kept everyone in the harem. These boys or young men would basically never go out. They had no experience of the real world. And then upon the death of their father, or on occasion their brother, they would be brought out to become sultan. So what this meant is that there was always a backup of other candidates if they didn't like one candidate. And this was what happened with Mustafa I. He turned out to be insane or possibly retarded or mentally ill. And in that process, he was basically put back in the harem, and they brought out Genç Osman, young Osman, who was only 14, but he was the next possible candidate there. And so this process came out that the next eldest male of the dynasty would succeed him. And so after they basically deposed Osman II, they put down the next eldest male. Now, what that is interesting is because what it kind of shows is that actually this whole system, this whole process, again, is not about sexual pleasure. It's actually about controlling, making sure there's enough candidates. And in the middle part, when the brothers were killing the half-brothers in the palace, they were left in a system when there was actually moments in which there weren't enough candidates. But once everyone was in this kafes, it was in the harem, and then they just kind of brought out the next candidate in line. These men were also had their sexuality controlled. So once they were in the harem, they were not allowed to have sex. They were not allowed to create children. Otherwise, they'd just have too many babies. But also, they would create too many possible successors and intrigues. Only the ruling sultan was allowed to have children. So this also limited the amount of male possible candidates at a time. But it also meant that once these sultans came out, sometimes they were quite young, but they were also very dependent on their mothers for survival because they had no experience of the real world. And in fact, that was one of the main jobs of queen mothers and their and chief consorts, is that they were supposed to support their sons, or in this case their lovers, by building alliances and connections with the outside world through marriages. Now, they weren't marrying people themselves, but they were sending their retired former slaves or servants from the harem, marrying them to statesmen, marrying them to other people, and therefore creating a network through which they could influence and understand the outside world. So what's interesting is that these queen mothers basically also never left the harem. Again, is not a large building, but had massive networks that spanned the entire Mediterranean and were aware of what was going on. Usually they would also marry their female children. So they often had, because once they had a male son, they were no longer allowed to have children or sex with the sultan, but they would have possibly female children, and those could be married out to princes or other statesmen, and those formed very strong connections. And so the females of the harem, specifically the queen mother, became the most important figures in a sultan's life, and therefore held an immense amount of power by themselves. The most powerful ones are a few. The first one is probably Roxalana, who is not powerful because of her structural position in the harem, but basically because she became the wife of Suleiman, the one and only time later kind of post-1400 sultan actually married a woman, is when he married Roxalana, and that's because he apparently was just deeply in love with her and decided to turn that into a marriage. But more common is these figures, people like Nurbanu Sultan, the mother of Murad III, and then of course, and Qasim Sultan, who was both mother of Murad IV and Ibrahim I. So she had two. How is this possible? She had a few. She had one, the mother of Murad IV, and is connected to Ibrahim I, but she was also the grandmother of another sultan. So she actually was probably the most powerful. She stayed in power as queen mother for the longest time into the life of Mehmed IV. And ultimately, she ended up clashing with her daughter-in-law. Well, they weren't married, so the daughter of her grandson, the mother of her grandson, Hatice Turhan Sultan. And apparently it seems that Hatice Turhan Sultan had Qasim Sultan murdered to basically get her out of the way so she could take the position of queen mother rather than be under the thumb of the queen grandmother. Now what's interesting also is that chief women, that is the queen mothers, also took an important role in building mosques. Now, if you remember, there's these gigantic imperial mosques that dot the hills of Istanbul, of Constantinople, and these could only be built after a major conquest. So, okay, with Mehmed II, that was the first one. Then you have, Selim and Suleiman. But then by the last ones, by the 17th century, after Ahmed I and the Blue Mosque, there were less and less major conquests because it became harder and harder to fight, especially very far away with reduced supply lines, etc. And so in these spaces, actually the queen mothers became the major patrons of imperial architecture and mosque architecture. That's because they had because of their positions, they received massive stipends, they had large land holdings that were given to them by their sons. And with that money, they then began to build heavily, including, for example, this gigantic mosque called the New Mosque on the border of Eminönü, which is today where the ferries dock. And this was a formerly Jewish neighborhood that burned down in a fire, and they built a large mosque in this area. Other major mosques are across all over Istanbul, including in places like Üsküdar and elsewhere. And so in these senses, queen mothers actually became central figures in the functioning of power and part of this new dispersed constellation of power at that time.